what is the contentless experience, and how should we kind of think about this characteristic experience in meditation?
Yeah, so this is a easy one for me to talk about because I've spent 7 years kind of looking at this and trying to, again, approach it systematically. These experiences you have in different forms of meditation, some forms of meditation are particularly associated with this kind of experience. They aim for this kind of experience. And the kind of academia picked up on this experience all the way back in the 60s and started to try and think about it and think about what it is. And this kind of common or classical view that was put forward is that in a contentless experience, there's a complete absence of content. And they were thinking in normal life, you have consciousness and its content, things like thoughts, perceptions, images, etc. And then in this meditation experience, the idea was that you're removing the content, removing all of the content really, and you're just left with consciousness itself. And for that reason, they talked about it as pure consciousness. It's consciousness with the content removed. It's this pure state. And sometimes, you might think if you take away all of the content, you wouldn't even have an experience because there wouldn't be anything it was like to be in that state. So in some of the accounts, they say, well, you take away everything, but they kind of hint at the idea that you might still just have kind of a bare consciousness or a bare wakefulness. In my work, I looked at this in detail, and I went through, one part of my project was to go through 135 expert texts on meditation from different traditions, and go through basically with a fine-tooth comb. And my concept was that you could take what seems like a fairly simple approach, or seems like a fairly obvious approach, and say, what content is absent in this experience, and is there any content that is present? And what I discovered, my main conclusion from all that work, is that there is a lot of content that is absent. In fact, it's much of the content that we'd ordinarily think of as mental content. So thoughts, perceptions, images, memories, concepts, the list goes on. But I guess the surprising finding was that there's also a lot of content that is present. And it's kind of what you might think of as abstract content, forms of content that you wouldn't normally think of. So something like silence and stillness. They're these things that contribute experientially to what this is like to be in this state. But then other things like naturalness, calm, rest, bliss or goodness, and then things that are even more kind of abstract or intangible, things like non-conceptual knowledge. So that's pretty interesting to think about, knowledge without concepts. And then also like things like freedom and unity and strength and all of this. And so what we concluded is that this contentless experience is not truly contentless, but, it could be said to be, in one sense, it is contentless. It's contentless in the more limited sense that it's lacking the more obvious forms of content. Yes.
But it still has, right? But it still has some kind of experience. And, when you kind of listed off the interesting ways in which there kind of are sort of different. There are some kinds of experience in it, even though it's not what we typically think of as experience. I'm wondering, what does that do to the meditator and to the different traditions as well? I mean, if there are slight differences, and we should actually sort of think more subtly about the different experiences, then I'm interested from that perspective. How should we think about meditation and what it does for us, if it's not really kind of not really just nothingness, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, to me, it kind of makes sense a bit that it's not an experience of simple nothingness, because these states are like quite attractive to people. People are spending a lot of time investing in their practice in order to access these states. And if it was simply a state of just nothingness, you might kind of query why you would aim for that or what would be the benefit of that. For example, one of the academics in kind of that classical collection of work talks about this experience as a mere blankness. And other people have kind of critiqued that and said, well, that really doesn't sound very attractive, and it doesn't sound like a very advanced mental state, or it doesn't sound like something that would greatly improve your life. But when you kind of look into it in that detailed, systematic way, and you start seeing these qualities of, stillness and profound naturalness and calm and depth and unity, then immediately you go, well, that's something that I'd like to experience. I could really imagine how that could help my life. In my work, I looked at what you're talking about, which is difference in the experiences across different practices, because this really fascinated me, because I was doing this fairly kind of humble technique that was meant to help reduce anxiety, among other things, but anxiety principally. And they're talking about this stillness, this kind of stillness state, which is how this contentless experience is often referred to. But then I was also seeing these states of complete stillness referred to in these big traditions, Buddhism, which has been around for thousands of years, and there's been, thousands and thousands of texts written kind of dissecting these practices and experiences. And we know about these, Buddhist practitioners who are going out and taking their practice incredibly seriously and meditating for 10 or 12 hours every day. They're talking about this stillness as well. And when I would read the different accounts, this was before I started my work, I'd read the different accounts and the stillness would sound identical. I mean, it was all the same qualities that they were talking about. In fact, it was quite uncanny how similar it was, in how they were talking about these states. And it was like a puzzle for me, because I was looking at this, really quite humble practice that I was doing, not really making any big claims, just aiming to help people a little bit with their mental health, and saying, how can it be that they're talking about accessing this kind of stillness within a few weeks or a few months in this practice? And then in Buddhism, like this kind of major goal is to access these states, and seemingly people are devoting their whole lives to kind of accessing these states. How does that fit together? If the two states are identical, then why would you kind of, treat it as your life task aiming for one, and in the other, you just treat it as this thing that is, really quite easily accessible? And I kind of reached a resolution concerning that, which I can talk about, but I don't know if you want me
Yeah.
to.